Hey YouTube, this is the beginning of my test for the shock block from Cooler Shock. It's been 48 hours since I started freezing this particular one. As you can see by the indicator, it's just above 0 degrees. I'll be putting it into this Coleman 50 quart cooler with a bunch of different cans of sodas and drinks. As you can see, that's about as much space as it takes up in a 50 quart cooler. And I'm going to be leaving this out in my garage in Florida, mostly to keep it out of the sun, but still have outdoor conditions. So this video is going to have a series of checks over however many days it lasts. It's going to be used because we're going to be consuming the drinks that I'm going to be putting in it. And I hope this test gives you a good idea of how long it'll last and, under real conditions, what you can expect from this product. This is the cooler loaded up with two 12-packs of cans. The cans have been pre-chilled to make sure that we're testing the longevity of the shock block and not its quick cooling capacity. As I said before, it's going to be left in my garage so we can simulate high temperatures. It's the middle of June, so it's easily 85 to 90 degrees in here on any given day. Alright, this is our 24-hour check-in. As we can see, the temperature is sitting at about 28 degrees, and it's gotten a little jelly, as you can see. Down the side, you can see kind of where the ice is still present, and this refrigerator thermometer I put in here has the temperature sitting just south of 40 degrees. So I'll go ahead and check in on it tomorrow and see how we're doing. Alright, this is the check-in at 48 hours. As you can see, it's reading at about 50 degrees inside the shock block. The temperature in the cooler is reading about the same. So I would say that it probably lasted about 2 days. As you can see, it's pretty much fully jelly. The next part of this test I'm going to be doing is with a ice block that I made out of 7 quarts of water, just to compare how a standard ice block holds up against the shock block itself. Okay, continuing with the test for the shock block, I've created a ice block that's the same volume of water, so 7 quarts as the cooler shock block. So I'm going to be testing this in the same conditions as the shock block to give you an apples-to-apples comparison between a solid block of ice versus the shock block's performance. This is the 24-hour check-in on the ice block I made. As you can see, the temperature just generally in the cooler is about 50 degrees. I'd say the block has melted a significant amount. We got probably about a half can's worth of water that's built up in the bottom here. So I'd say it's probably on the same melting level as the shock block, but we'll see how well it goes over the next 24 hours. So this is our check-in at 48 hours. As you can see, the ice block is completely melted. The water is still very cold, but the ambient temperature is getting up to about 55 degrees Fahrenheit at the moment. So, just looking at it, it lasts about the same amount of time as the shock block does, but the ambient temperature is actually much higher, even though the water is probably still about 32 degrees. Okay, this is going to be the final test that I have for the shock block in my cooler. For this test, I added about 1.5 inches of ice cold water to the bottom of the cooler. I just want to see if additional water would help distribute the temperature better from the shock block and maybe help it last a little bit longer. So we'll see how this works out, and we'll be doing 24-hour updates like I did with the rest of the tests. Alright, it's been a couple hours since I added the shock block with the water in the bottom of the cooler. As you can see down here, you got some ice formation around the shock block in and of itself. And this is pretty thick, to the point that this is actually frozen to the bottom of my cooler at the moment. So you can see the different pieces of ice in here. So this just gives you a good idea of exactly how cold this thing can get, and it is very capable of freezing water. So this is our 24-hour update into the second test with the shock block. As you can see, the temperature is right around 25 degrees. Still have a lot of ice formation on the bottom here, and it's still pretty well frozen to the bottom of my cooler. As you can see, the ice actually moved around and moved around the different soda cans that are in here. So we'll go ahead and continue this test and see what happens in the next 24 hours. This is the final check-in for the shock block test. It's been 48 hours. As you can see, the shock block's totally spent. The water hasn't been frozen anymore, so there's no more ice from when it was put in. And temperature of the water is in the upper 50s at the moment. So that should conclude the test. It didn't seem to make much of a difference with adding the water to the bottom. It did distribute the temperature better, but in terms of longevity, it didn't really make a difference. Alright, so this is my final evaluation of the shock block after testing it out in my cooler for the last week or so. Since I'm working on starting another test with it, the one that I used for the test is currently in my freezer. So I still have the flat version here just for something to watch while I'm talking about it. To compare the shock block to a full-blown ice block, both of which I used 7 quarts to fill the shock block as well as 7 quarts to make the ice block. In terms of longevity, the shock block and the ice block lasted about the same amount of time. And generally speaking, I would say that the shock block is capable of doing anything an ice block is able to do, and the shock block is able to do some things the ice block can't. So if you want to have a cooler that's keeping things cold but not getting them sopping wet, the shock block has the advantage over a standard ice block. If you want to try and cool down your drinks and distribute the temperature or distribute the cooling capacity of the shock block throughout the cooler in the same sense that a ice block would as it melts, you simply add some water to the bottom of the cooler, and that water will be kept at a very cold temperature by the shock block and will keep your drinks cold and distribute the temperature equally well. So, and in terms of freezing ability, the process I use to make my ice blocks consists of using an old cooler that I fill with water and stick in my freezer. Because the cooler is insulated, it freezes directionally from the top to the bottom of the cooler. So generally speaking, the very bottom of the ice block is usually the last thing to freeze. And because of that, if I want a solid ice block, I actually have to freeze it for about 48 hours, take it out of the cooler, and put it back in my freezer for another 6 to 12 hours. You don't have to worry about that with the shock block. It freezes completely in about 48 hours, and that's easy to tell with the included thermometer, whereas with an ice block, you kind of have to manipulate it around, see if you can see a bubble of air moving around inside of the block, and that'll tell you whether or not the water is totally frozen. So if you have the freezer space and you're looking for a product that can replace an ice block, the shock block is an excellent option and something to be looked into. If you found this video to be useful, please give it a like and share it around. And also look out for my next video where I'm going to be testing this as a method of cooling down a large water cooler of water. I believe mine's a 10-gallon version, so probably won't be very helpful if you have a smaller one than that. But I'll discuss that all in the next video. Have a good evening.